From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
So it was Christmas Eve 2023. Sandie Peggie, who's a nurse, and Beth Upton, who's a doctor, were both working at Victoria Hospital in Fife. So basically, they're both looking forward to spending Christmas Day with their families. They've had another frantic shift, as it was described. Sandie Peggie's gone to the female changing room in the A&E department. She says she was encountering a heavy period. She's gone inside to find Beth Upton there, who is a doctor and a transgender woman. Now, what's said between those two is disputed, but there was then a confrontation between them. Peggie expressed her discomfort at sharing a female space with someone she considers male. So Upton would then, within a few hours, lodge a bullying complaint against Sandie. This led to a sequence of events which would spark one of the most contentious and divisive employment tribunals in British legal history.
The Employment Tribunal in the case of Sandie Peggie versus NHS Fife and Dr Beth Upton began in February and it resumes this week. But this is more than an ordinary workplace dispute. In the wake of the Supreme Court's landmark ruling back in April, how do institutions define a woman? This case may be the first test. The story today: the landmark legal battle of Peggie versus the NHS.
So my name's Dan Sanderson and I am the Scottish political editor for the Times and the Sunday Times.
Daniel, you were telling us about Christmas Eve 2023 when a shift at the hospital in Kirkcaldy ended quite dramatically. Just tell us a bit more about the two people involved.
Yeah, so Sandie Peggie is a nurse, I think in her early 50s. So she'd worked for the NHS for about 30 years. She'd had an unblemished record. Beth Upton is an A&E doctor. She qualified from the University of Dundee in 2021. Now, Upton transitioned and began living as a woman in January 22. She then got a job at the hospital in August of 2023. So shortly after starting at the hospital, Upton used female changing rooms, as she had done in previous jobs. So the issue of pronouns in this case has been really contentious. There was a hearing earlier before the tribunal kicked off, where basically Sandie Peggie's legal team wanted to refer to Beth Upton as a he. They claimed their whole case is that Upton is male and therefore it would be odd and potentially prejudicial if they were to have to call Upton she, because they just do not accept that Upton is a woman. NHS Fife and Upton opposed this. They said everyone should be compelled to use female pronouns for Upton. The tribunal came up with a bit of a fudge, so they've decided that where they can, will avoid using gendered pronouns for Upton. So we've had a discussion about this in the office this morning. We've decided probably the fairest thing is to refer to Upton in neutral terms. Peggie's side has successfully persuaded the tribunal that that's what they should do. So we thought the fairest thing in this instance is to try and stick with what the tribunal has ruled.
So that's what we'll be doing for the rest of this episode. Dan, as you said, at the end of 2023, Peggie finds Dr Beth Upton in the changing room. Something happens, there's some kind of altercation. Memories of it vary. Do we know what each side alleges was said at the time?
So as you say, recollections vary. According to Upton, they were subjected to a barrage of invective from Sandie Peggie. Upton said that Peggie questioned their chromosomes, raised the case of Isla Bryson, the infamous Scottish rapist who had recently at that point been initially placed into a female prison. Jane Russell, the KC representing NHS Fife, and Upton described Peggie as behaving like a dog with a bone, as subjecting them to this relentless attack, which left Upton feeling cornered. Now, Sandie Peggie, on the other hand, admits there was a confrontation, admits she made clear that she wasn't happy with Upton in the female changing rooms, but her characterisation of it is that it was a lot more measured, a lot more of a discussion rather than a one-way attack. So, I mean, the basic facts aren't disputed. There was a confrontation. Peggie admitted raising Upton's chromosomes. She admitted raising the case of Isla Bryson, but said she hadn't meant to suggest that Upton was, somehow comparable. But she was making a wider point about single-sex spaces. So both sides admit there was a row. They admit there was a confrontation. The nature and character of that is what is disputed.
And then Upton lodged a formal complaint with the hospital. Just talk us through how they responded.
Within a few hours, Upton had emailed their line manager raising this case, saying they no longer felt safe in the changing room. Within a few days, Sandie Peggie had been placed on special leave. Then there was a formal suspension, and she remained suspended for several months.
And Peggie responded by suing the hospital over this. Just explain why.
So Sandie Peggie's case is that she was a victim of discrimination and harassment by having to share a female single-sex space with someone she considers male. I think it's important to say that no one is alleging that Beth Upton did anything inappropriate in the changing room, but Sandie Peggie's case is that the mere presence of Upton in the changing room amounted to harassment and discrimination because, in Peggie's view, Upton is a male and therefore should not have been in that single-sex space.
So this whole case goes to tribunal. That started in February and it was public. Is that normal?
Yeah, it's normal for a tribunal to be in public. It's not normal the level of attention this one has obviously received. But yeah, there was an effort by NHS Fife to first of all hold it in secret, and then failing that, for the participants to be anonymised. Now, there were arguments for that on both sides, but the employment judge ultimately decided that these were issues of real public concern and that in the interests of open justice, it should be held in public.
And you mentioned that there was a huge amount of public interest in the tribunal. Just describe how that played out. Yeah,
so a lot of people were following this online. There was a facility for people to sort of dial in and watch it live. Now, this is available in most tribunals, but it's not something the public generally is very interested in. But in this case, you had people from all over the UK and beyond trying to watch this case, follow along, commenting on it on social media. Now, this did cause problems during the hearings. The software the court uses is quite antiquated, so you had people failing to mute themselves, constant interruptions. If, one of the hundreds of people that joined in hadn't muted their microphone, then, it sort of became a bit ridiculous when at one point someone started blow drying their hair.
Oh, no.
Which then played into the courtroom and everyone had to get up and leave and start again. There was repeated warnings from the judge about this, but yeah, it caused a lot of trouble, and NHS Fife during this recess has actually again tried to say that while the press should be able to watch, that the public should not, because it's caused so many issues. Again, the judge has ruled against that. So the public will be able to watch it if they register and get the appropriate login details and everything. But I think it's going to be a bit more tightly controlled this time.
Hopefully they'll remember to mute themselves. I mean, it does sound like chaos. You watched the tribunal. You weren't the one drying your hair, I hope.
No.
What was it like? Just describe how it played out.
It was, at times it sort of felt like it was almost like a courtroom drama. It was very unusual for an employment tribunal, which, are often quite dry and and technical. So we had Sandie Peggie giving her evidence. She was setting out why she was opposed to Beth Upton being in the changing rooms, basically saying she had no issue with Beth, in her words, that she respected them as a doctor, but that she just had an issue with, she sees it, males being in female single-sex spaces. Jane Russell, the KC for NHS Fife and Upton, I think there were a lot of people seem to be attacking Peggie's character in cross-examination. She raised her support for Donald Trump, which Peggie had admitted. She said, yes, I do quite like Donald Trump, but that doesn't make me a bigot.
Amazing that came up in a court case, in a tribunal.
Yeah, absolutely. Peggie's husband, Darren, was called to give evidence, and he was sort of confronted over, I think, what were quite clearly like racist Facebook posts that he put up on his own page in the past. He sort of said, I just thought it was funny and tried to downplay it. But I think the really big moment, and when this really captured the public's attention, was when Beth Upton gave evidence. Now, Upton was quite calm throughout, but very strident. They claimed that at one point, I am a biological woman, which proved quite controversial. Upton described the concept of biological sex as a nebulous dog whistle. Then Naomi Cunningham, who is representing Sandie Peggie, is a really fearsome KC. I certainly wouldn't want to be cross-examined by her. She repeatedly referred to Upton as a male. Upton was repeatedly saying, I'm not a male, I'm a woman. So there was a lot of that. After the grueling cross-examination by Cunningham, Upton was asked by her KC about the impact this had all had. They were clear that they'd found the whole process incredibly distressing, spoke about being targeted on social media, about even how some people had tried to find out when they were at work and was fearing things like protests at the hospital. They claimed they simply wanted to be going on with their life, had no interest in being a sort of figure in the culture wars, but clearly felt that that's what they had become. So yeah, it was clear that Upton was very, very upset and I think appeared to have been left fairly traumatised by the whole process.
And Dan, that cross-examination was so intense that the tribunal actually ran out of time. It's been in recess since February. It restarted this week, but a lot has happened in the meantime.
Yeah, absolutely. So they broke up in February. Basically, it overran massively. Upton's cross-examination took a lot longer than they thought. July was the next point at which everyone's diaries aligned for it to come back. But, within a few months, we had this massively consequential ruling that would potentially change the way this case would be viewed.
Dan, you were telling us about this employment tribunal, which has gripped so much of the public, all centring around a nurse and a doctor in an NHS hospital in Fife. The tribunal went into recess in February. It restarted this week. In the meantime, there's been a huge decision from the Supreme Court, which could change everything. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, so obviously the Supreme Court came back in April with this really huge landmark judgment, which on the face of it is a huge victory for Sandie Peggie's side, was certainly welcomed by her legal team. So I think it's important to say on the face of it, it perhaps doesn't impact this case hugely, because the issue the Supreme Court was ruling on was gender recognition certificates, and we know that Beth Upton does not have a gender recognition certificate. However, the reasoning the court went through, they asserted that the biology was principle in determining biological sex that cannot change no matter how someone identifies. And they also endorsed the very sort of blanket ban on trans women using women's single-sex spaces that Sandie Peggie had been arguing for. So while the sort of headline issue at stake may not be relevant, I think the reasoning the court went through and the implications flowing from the ruling are really going to be significant in the next few weeks.
And this will be one of the first cases that really tests what that judgment means, I guess. In the meantime, we've also discovered a lot about what was happening to Sandie Peggie before she launched this tribunal. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so very soon after the tribunal broke up in February, we learned that Sandie Peggie was actually still being investigated by NHS Fife, and this disciplinary process, which had been referred to in the tribunal, but had been sort of skirted around, was still ongoing. And not only that she still faced the sack potentially. Now, clearly, Sandie over the previous few weeks had picked up a lot of support from various quarters. So this idea that she could potentially still be sacked for what her supporters saw as just standing up for women's rights caused huge controversy and provoked outrage among many of her supporters.
And what exactly is she being investigated for?
So she's being investigated for, well, first of all, the Christmas Eve incident and the misgendering. So she's being investigated for, the way she behaved towards Beth Upton. Now, she's also being investigated for what are alleged to be patient safety issues. So the first of these centres around an allegation that in a resuscitation area at some point in late 2023, Sandie Peggie was in there carrying out observations, as is the normal job of the nurse. Beth Upton entered, and then Sandie Peggie stopped what she was doing, said to Beth Upton, you do it, and basically walked off. So, that was the first one. The second one is alleged to have taken place on December the 18th, 2023. So just, a few days before this changing room showdown on Christmas Eve. So on that occasion, Sandie Peggie was working in the triage area of the A&E. A child came in and then left without being seen. It's alleged that Upton then asked Sandie Peggie about this child, said, what was wrong with them? Where have they gone? It's alleged that Sandie refused to answer. Upton instead sort of spoke through a colleague, and basically that this alleged failure to properly communicate or work with Beth Upton was putting patients at risk. Now, I think it's important to say that Sandie strenuously denies that this ever happened. She says these allegations were effectively made up by Beth Upton. Her team points out that they weren't raised at the time, as even Beth Upton acknowledged in evidence that they should have been. So this has been hanging over the whole case, that while this big tribunal's going on, Sandie Peggie has been being investigated by the health board, and she was told that this could lead to her dismissal. Now, on the morning of the tribunal, so on Wednesday morning, this bombshell dropped. I was driving up to cover the first day, my phone started blowing up, and it emerged that late on Tuesday night, Sandie Peggie had been informed that she had been cleared of all allegations, so the misgendering, as well as the patient safety issues. So this was really a sort of bolt from the blue. It raises real questions, I think, over where NHS Fife goes from here. The defence so far has basically been that, Sandie Peggie was guilty of this. She acted with hostility towards Upton because they are trans. So the fact that she is now being cleared of that in a separate investigation, NHS Fife has admitted that they didn't have the evidence to find against her, I think raises all sorts of questions for, where they go from here. And indeed, Jane Russell, the KC, who is now in a difficult position in that they are representing Upton and NHS Fife jointly. So we really have a sort of divergence between the positions of NHS Fife now and the positions of Beth Upton, yet they're being represented by the same KC jointly.
So, Daniel, we have the tribunal resuming this week. Do we know who we can expect to hear from?
Yeah, so we've actually just had the first morning of evidence. I'm speaking to you in the lunch break. So although the eyes of the UK are on this tribunal, it's actually being held in a tiny little room in Dundee. There's just 6 seats, 2 rows of 6 seats, which I was lucky enough to get one of them. I was sat directly behind Sandie Peggie. It was stiflingly hot. A lot of Sandie Peggie supporters had turned up. They had to make do with an overflow room. She arrived at about 9:45 this morning with her solicitor, Margaret Gribben, who gave a brief statement just outlining the fact that Sandie had been cleared and her relief at that. We've heard this morning from Isla Bumba, who was the Equality and Human Rights lead for NHS Fife. Earlier hearings had heard that it was her advice that after Peggie initially raised concerns informally, which led to Upton being given, ongoing permission to access the female changing rooms. Now, this morning it's been Jane Russell, NHS Fife and Upton's KC, that has been questioning Bumba. This afternoon, we're going to see cross-examination from Naomi Cunningham, which I think will likely be more interesting and slightly more uncomfortable for Isla Bumba. We're also going to hear from Kate Searle, who was Beth Upton's line manager. Now, they're seen as really crucial to this case. It was Kate Searle who got the initial complaint on Christmas Eve, the early hours of Christmas Day, from Beth Upton. And we're also expecting to hear from Angela Glancy, who was clinical nurse manager, who was also seen as playing a really key role in the early stages of the investigation, which led to Sandie Peggie being suspended for several months, investigated, albeit now cleared, as we've just found out this morning.
Dan, if this case concludes in favour of Sandie Peggie, what would that mean?
If Sandie Peggie wins this case, I think there are going to be real questions of NHS Fife and the Scottish Government over how it got to this stage. We found out that recently that up to May this year, NHS Fife had spent over £220,000 defending this case. There was an expectation after the Supreme Court ruling that they might concede or at least try and settle it. That hasn't happened, is our understanding. So if they go on and lose, I think, they're going to face accusations of squandering public money on basically an ideological cause when the law and the facts were never on their side. I think there'll be calls for senior figures at the health board to step down, and also the Scottish Government is going to be dragged into this. Questions over why they didn't step in and instruct NHS Fife to settle, and also whether the SNP government stance on gender. We had Nicola Sturgeon's failed self-ID law. They've been very pro self-ID. They have their own policies in place which would allow someone like Beth Upton to access female changing rooms elsewhere in the public sector. So I think we'll see a lot of recrimination, and it'll be another in sort of what is now becoming a long line of cases, not just the Supreme Court, but previous employment tribunals, where the rights of women to have single-sex spaces based on biological sex is asserted again, and there'll be real pressure on public bodies, throughout the UK to change their policies and make clear that trans people are not able to access facilities that align with their gender identity.
And on that, if the winners in this tribunal are NHS Fife and Dr Beth Upton, there are still those questions left, aren't there? Despite the Supreme Court ruling, institutions still seem uncertain about what their responsibilities are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if Beth Upton and NHS Fife were to win, that would only deepen that uncertainty. I mean, the first thing to say is if that happened, I'd expect Sandie Peggie and her legal team to appeal very quickly. But yeah, if that was to happen, I think the trans rights side of this debate would see it as a bit of, welcome good news. They feel that they haven't had much of that recently. And yeah, I think it would really cause a lot of confusion within the public sector about, how they deal with the Supreme Court ruling, what internal policies they need to have in place, and also beyond the public sector as well. This affects like every business in Britain. So I think everyone will be watching this, or should be watching this very, very closely. And yeah, the implications will be wide range in whatever the result.
That was Dan Sanderson, Scottish political editor for The Times, and you can follow Dan's minute-by-minute coverage of the tribunal at thetimes.com with a subscription. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme tune were by Mao Lassetto. We know this is a subject with many opinions, so please do feel free to share yours with us. You can email us to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you again tomorrow.